folks, this is Dr. Emily Scherning with AR. As I'm studying the 5th National Climate Assessment, which, this is the biggest and best consensus science update we're going to get for the US until 2027 at least. I was really struck as I'm reading this by the quality of the chapter on mitigation. I know we talk mostly about resilience on this channel, about getting ready for the changes that are coming, but we should all be able to agree that mitigation is also critical. For us as a global society to come in on any significantly non-collapsed scenario, emissions need to come way down. So related to that goal, you might hear about this idea net zero 2050. I've seen that phrase in more and more places, city level, state level. I've heard it in corporate PR. I know I've heard it, and my response honestly has been very uncritical, like, cool, sounds good, because there are tons of smart people working in mitigation. It's better funded than resilience and adaptation work. I figure people are doing a good job. And reading the mitigation chapter of the NCA5, it really expanded my understanding of what net zero by 2050 means. And I think that you are also going to want to understand it better. So we're going to walk through it. The figures I'm going to share, I think they're very cool and interesting. And I want to hear what you think, because my read on the current mitigation plan is that this is a serious moonshot. And while that means it could be in reach, we all need a better understanding of what it means, because it doesn't just require technology like our previous moonshot. It requires much bigger shifts in the popular culture and people's daily lives than I think most folks are envisioning. Let's get into it. Just as we get rolling here, we're going to start with the big picture figure. And I want you to know you can access all of these figures and more, and you should read the chapter in context if you're really interested. I'm going to be pulling the figures from this all figures page here, nca2023.globalchange.gov/alt-figures in chapter 32, mitigation. You should read them in context. There's a lot more information, but it's nice to be able to just present a big, clear figure. So that's how we're going to do it here. So here we're looking at US greenhouse gas emissions by sector with 2030 and 2050 goals added. We're looking back to the 90s. So you can see that from our peak, we have made cuts. But to get the cuts to hit net zero by 2050 and the 2030 goals, the cuts need to be way bigger. These next 7 years have to be very intense years of change. And let's look at what's going right and what's going wrong with this figure. Where do we need the most change? We see that industry overall has managed to shrink. It looks to me like transportation really stands out as the sector that's continuing to grow so far. And I think this is why people get so excited about electric cars, is because they think that's a good way to shrink this sector. I really lean away from the electric car solution as a cure-all, and you'll see why. You'll see why in a big way as we look at some more evidence as we go through this video. I also want us to note what other sector is growing in the wrong way. Check out down here, we're looking at land use growing in the wrong way. So carbon sinks are going in the wrong way. They're shrinking when they need to be growing. And forests are burning, right? So we'll talk more about these issues related to transportation and to land use change as we walk through other solid figures in this chapter. Right now, we look at this figure and it's like, oh, the line is going to go down. And we can see line has to go down in a dramatic way for us to hit net zero 2050. So let's try and understand what has to happen underneath that line to make the line go down. All right, so check this out, figure 32.8. Okay, this is a figure where it's actually worth feeling some optimism, which I bet you were not expecting based on the last figure. Like reasonable optimism? I know, that's really wild, I know. The technology on solar and wind, the technology for sustainable energy is really getting solid. It's really getting affordable, increasingly more affordable than fossil fuel energy generation. And as someone who was pricing out solar in like 2000 and haven't checked in because I was so scared by the enormous costs then, this is really a cool figure to check out. And, there are incredible reductions, not only in cost, but in accessibility to energy sources that could potentially help us to get under the line, under the net zero 2050 line, and stick the landing on a 2-degree future, not go above 2 degrees. how are we going to do it? So there's some actual paths forward in this next figure. All right, let's check out figure 32.9. This is a really long figure. Let's talk it through. The basic story is that this figure lets us look at how we've historically added energy capacity in America and how much we've added. Like you can see here, around 2000 to 2005, we did a tremendous upgrade of the infrastructure where we put in a lot of natural gas burning infrastructure. Looking here, 2020 to 2050, we can see some different paths forward for how much energy and what profile of energy generation we need to add to reach 2050 net zero goals. So basic story, we're talking about adding just a tremendous amount of wind and solar over the next couple of decades. If you're in an area that is actively engaged in the energy transformation, this work is already quite visible. And if we look on this figure here, we can see this yellow is wind. There's been a lot of wind energy being added, a lot of solar energy being added. Nothing like what we need to be doing in the annual average adding moving forward, but like we're getting there. We're starting to really move on this. It's also worth noting that in the last bar here of what we've been doing, we start to see this red come in, storage. Adding storage, adding energy storage battery capacity to this electrified grid is also going to be really important. Looking at these per year paths forward, some of them are like enormous. We've never added more than 200 gigawatts per year, right? But if we look at some of these lower scenarios where we're able to move forward, in the early 2000s, we added more than 50 gigawatts per year. And the 70s here, you can see that was a long time ago too. Totally different scale of infrastructure. We got close to 50 gigawatts per year. A lot of these requiring around 175 gigawatts per year. That's not so insane. That's not so far beyond America's capacities. We might have to spend like some huge amounts of money on it, right? Like spend money on this instead of constant war, which the Department of Defense, by the way, would prefer because they see climate as amongst the biggest national security threats that we face. They have consistently asked for more action related specifically to climate infrastructure and onshoring manufacturing. So I thought those last couple of figures were really cool and interesting. It lets us see historic data on how much renewables used to cost, how cheap they are, and the potential that we have to move forward in getting energy infrastructure going on the ground. But here's the part that I don't think people really get when we talk about the energy future. I know I didn't get how big of a part this was projected in the net zero 2050 plan. This is the tricky part. Let's look at individual energy use. We're going to look at figure 32.11. All right, so figure 32.11, we're looking at characteristics of US energy systems in climate mitigation scenarios. If you look at this figure in context in the paper, it talks about how the energy transformation will need to take place with, quote, modest reductions in per capita energy use. I was looking at this, I was like, okay, each step down looks reasonable, but I wonder what this means. I wonder when Americans last had energy use below 150 gigajoules per person. So I started looking into that. I found this website from the energy industry. And, there's going to be differences in these two figures. Figure 32.11, we were talking about gigajoules. Here we're talking about a million BTUs. These are actually pretty close energy units. They have like a 5% difference between each other. So I'm not going to do the conversion. We're just going to know things are going to be a little bit floppy here. And it's not 100% clear to me if this gigajoules per person is per person globally or if it's per person in the US. Whereas in this energy industry website, we are talking about per person in the US. So if we check this out, the last time that we were around 150 of these energy units was maybe 1920. I am not sure that most people would say cutting their energy usage to 1920 levels would be a modest drop. I I feel like this is something that we really need to be looking in the face as we look at this mitigation scenario is how much this scenario anticipates people's lives are going to change. So, I want to tell you about this from my perspective because I live a lower energy lifestyle and I really like it. I don't want to say that my choices are the right choices for like every human because my lifestyle is pretty weird, but I really enjoy it. And a big part of what lets me run AR instead of selling my brain products to the highest bidder is the fact that my family made a radical lifestyle downshift to use less of everything. Our costs are way lower, we have more time, we have more freedom, we like it more. I think it's a good way to live. I enjoy it. But as a person who loves freedom, a person whose personal freedom is extremely important to them, and I believe that people need free access to information, my family's lifestyle requires much more daily physical labor than the average American lifestyle today. I mean, like, if you ever think about me randomly and you wonder what I'm doing, I'm probably doing some sort of moderately intense domestic labor. That's something to think about. I think for many people, this level of reduction in energy use would not read as modest at all. I think it would read as very foreign to their lifestyle and their priorities, especially as we get towards that 2050 personal energy consumption level. The easiest way for me to understand the size of that drop is that in this future scenario, most people don't have cars. That would be the way to bring it down, would be to go back to a cable car type system. That could be good to not have car if you had a good cable car type system, you had good infrastructure. A lot of people like living carless in a city. Or if we look at this big drop, that transition could be bad. Like I live in the middle of nowhere. A public transit option that meets my needs, not likely. So, what's the mechanism by which we're going to move towards a future where most people don't have cars? It matters to look at what these numbers mean in terms of how we live our lives. Many people who have high consumption lifestyles, a normal American lifestyle, they don't know how to envision a drop that wouldn't hurt. I think it's worth looking at that issue. I just want to contribute my own experience that the drop feels good, but you have to have a lot of skills to make it feel good, and it takes time to build them. And it's the difference to make the drop as a choice, like I did, or to think about making this drop through various forms of coercion, which is not cool. This personal use drop, it's something we need to start talking about. See how we feel, experiment with different ways of living if we're going to make this drop. I think it would be helpful in the national conversation for more people to try it and talk about our experiences. If our experiences can go beyond a sense of being denied, like this sense of being denied that people have when they're dieting, and towards a good feeling, like when people experience renewed health or energy based on a change in their lifestyle, that's something that we should know about. And like, I'm pretty weird. I don't know if everyone else is going to have the same experience. I'd like to hear about it. All I have is my family's experience with making the drop. I'd love to hear from you. Talking about personal experiences and choices, we've got another big personally impacting element in going below that line to net zero. That's in figure 32.12. All right, 32.12, we're talking about diet. Look at this figure, folks. This is completely wild. The size of the difference here is huge. People who have reduced or eliminated meat consumption, who are thinking about it, check it out, because this impact is huge, not only related to emissions, but to increasing our ability to have land preserved for habitat, increasing our ability to use land in a way that is healthy for everyone, for every living creature. It's really big. You can still eat like a pretty big amount of red meat here and contribute in a positive way. Look at how much lower the emissions are and look at how much land use comes back with this reduction in red meat. So I want to tell you a little bit about my experience making this reduction because this was really hard for me. I eat little red meat now. Many of my family members are vegetarians. They say I'm gross. I don't appreciate it. I think that eating meat can be a dietary thing. There are people who need to eat a lot of meat because they have various GI and allergy issues, digestive issues. No hate there, right? I think there's also the fact that in many cultures, meat consumption is like super weighted. And that was definitely true for me. And it still is true for me. You know, my background hasn't changed. I grew up in a cultural world where eating meat was really important. I'm from Chicagoland. Chicago is the city of meat. All the meats in Chicago are delicious and you can eat them all together. And like many people from immigrant backgrounds, my family came to the new country to eat meat. Eating meat meant that we were American. If you didn't eat meat at least once a day, preferably twice a day, people felt poor. You felt rich if you ate meat at every meal. So for me, transitioning to a low meat lifestyle, I eat meat maybe twice a week. My kids think that I'm barbarous. It's I run into a lot of young children who are just not into meat, whose like parents force them to eat meat. I think I would rather have my children harass me than force them to eat meat, but that's my situation. The transition was emotionally hard. If I don't eat some meat, I get like a meat madness, so I have to eat some of it. But, getting away from meat, the evidence is super clear. It's super big that it's important. That moving away from a culture where meat is so emotionally loaded, where meat at every meal is the thing that makes you feel good about yourself and questioning that assumption, it's a big part of getting under the line and reaching net zero. I mean, you might not have seen a figure that shows how big this is before. It's really big. I think it's interesting to note that veganism is not necessarily the best from an emissions standpoint, although we see it is for health. Vegans, please don't immediately go into attack mode that I didn't say you are the best at everything. I'm sure it would be possible to do a lower emission vegan diet. The one they're plotting here, maybe it's got like a lot of palm oil in it. I think that looking at critically at this figure, though, does let us see there are a range of dietary choices that would be healthy for people and better for the planet. Looking at the lower edge of this figure again, looking at those green lines that go below the bar, I think that the carbon sequestration in that figure is assuming that we take the land used to feed cattle and rewild it to some extent. Turn it back into a carbon sink, which means maybe letting it be habitat in the best case scenario. That's going to be really important as we consider our next figure. I've only got 3 more figures to go in the story. Stay with me here. They're all important. This is where things are going to start going off the rails. All right, we're talking about carbon sequestration now. We're talking about CO2 removal in US net zero scenarios. Let's check this out. How are we currently doing with carbon sequestration? We suck at it. Look at that 2020 figure. We're really bad at it. And we're only planning on getting sort of good at it by 2030. And then we're projecting we're going to take so much of it, right? And these units could be hard to understand. I can definitely get that. So let's compare them, talking about carbon sequestration into land to how much is currently being sequestered in US land. And we can sort of eyeball it. We can see that this box is bigger by a little bit from the direct air capture plan by 2050. And we can see that it is bigger than the 2040 bioenergy carbon capture. When we look at 2050, we want there to be a doubling in size of the net carbon sequestration from land use changes in forestry. And we are expecting also, look at the sizes of these boxes, a sequestration of carbon that we don't currently know how to do that is at least as large as the net carbon sequestration from land use, land change, and forestry in the US as of 2020. We want to sequester as much CO2 through technological means as we currently have carbon in American land use sequestration. I think it's really crazy, like a little more out there than I feel comfortable with, to say that by 2050, we're going to sequester as much carbon through technological means as we currently sequester in like all American habitat. I think that rather than thinking about doubling habitat, we could, and getting this extra third from technological sequestration, logically we could think about tripling the habitat instead. The money that's going into R&D for carbon capture is sometimes going into very questionable goof stuff that someone's cousin came up with, right? You could be preserving habitat now and restoring habitat now. I'm just saying, we have carbon sequestration technology that works in drought, in deep freeze, in extreme heat. It's called a prairie. Check this out. Look at a wide variety of maps. About a third of America used to be covered in prairie. There's very little mention of prairie in the NCA5. They talk about forests. Prairies are where it's at, man. Trees, they burn, they're going to release all the carbon. Prairies like being set on fire. They think it's fun. I love trees, but we need to think beyond trees. And we need to remember that we have solutions that are already in our grasp that can provide powerful natural carbon sequestration that is resilient against the kind of threats that we're going to face. I found this to be a troubling look at how much we're relying on yet to be developed technology in the 2050 scenario. I knew there was some of that. I didn't know what a big component it was until I looked at this figure. I think that it's worth noting, though, there are potentially alternate pathways forward, particularly if we make those land use changes based on moving away from the consumption of red meat on an industrial scale. And guys who are very defensive about the thought of eating less red meat, remember, we made exceptions. Remember on that figure, there's still a lot of red meat in there. All right, 32.19. Here's another technology problem. You need minerals to build modern tech. We import them, not because we don't have them, but because large-scale mining really sucks. A certain amount of our emissions reduction the last 10 years in the US is related to the fact that we outsource a lot of things that are super polluting. We outsource a lot of industry. Nobody wants to live by a mine. Think about how big the mineral needs are for all the batteries it would take to make every car an electric car. It's inconceivable. It's very evident looking at the goals and the realities that reduction of personal and household energy use is a bigger part of net zero by 2050 than is really being communicated. And we need to talk about it. This needs to be communicated. We need to be able to see what this future is going to look like. I can definitely envision ways this could be very oppressive, this transition. I say this with concern as being myself a low consumption, prairie restoring, biodiversity obsessed general freak. I very much enjoy the way I live. I don't know how much the average American would like being life swapped with me. I don't know. Let's look at what's holding us back that's not like a physical limiting factor. What's holding us back that's not a physical limiting factor? In figure 32.23, a cute palindrome, it's time to look at corporations and what they are doing around net zero 2050. We all know corporations are not meeting their climate commitments. Also, they're not really people. Maybe we shouldn't let fictive legal entities destroy the world. I don't know. So who's bad here? No surprises. Look at the column for the transportation industry. They're not even doing inventory. Oh, okay. That's not really a surprise, though, right? That the transportation industry isn't really doing inventory because it's very obvious the future doesn't actually let everyone have an electric car. So the transportation industry is taking an appropriate corporate action focused on profit. All they've done here really is participate in initiatives. That means taking big lumps of government money. Nice. Who else is bad? Let's see who else is bad. Construction is bad. Bad construction industry. You can see construction is willing to take a little money and do a little inventory, but as you can see, nothing else. Perhaps this is also related to a profit motive, which clearly translates in reality to slapping up as much luxury housing as possible and building basically none of the walkable neighborhoods people want. None of the type of density of housing many people seem to enjoy, which is 3 to 4 story multifamily units with shops and parks and stuff mixed in. Cities that didn't have those kind of neighborhoods back in the 20s don't appear to be getting many of them now. The bottom line about corporations, you can say in a quote from the report, 20% or fewer across all sectors are reported as reducing process emissions or affecting company behavior changes. That's the biggest thing right now, stopping us from meeting net zero by 2050. Let's take a minute. So we need net zero 2050 to stay on the RCP 4.5 pathway. That's the pathway where we can build a good future, a lasting future. What does that look like for you? I feel like we've seen it here now as we've looked at these figures more. Your individual actions do matter. Reducing your consumption matters a lot. Your consumption of energy, your consumption of plastic, For most people, your consumption of meat is very important, very valuable. Net zero 2050, it looks like it would place most people in walkable urban type neighborhoods, which is what most people seem to like. I think it goes without saying that I don't like it. It's a fine thing to like. If you like that kind of lifestyle, that's great. I'm like a no crowds human. I feel maybe it's more resilient to be where food and energy comes from. That's just me. We'll talk about resilience more soon as we start hitting the state level energy forecasts in about 2 weeks. I wanted to give us all some time to look at this part of the big picture. Think about how it impacts your resilience staging, especially if, like me, you're a person who is not compatible with the sustainable urban lifestyle implied by this big picture. One thing to me is clear: whether as a nation we manage to follow this plan or not, personal action does matter. I encourage you, in closing, to experiment with this idea. Is there a way you could use the drop, the reduction in consumption, to free yourself in some way? I'm here being able to put time into this project because the drop helped free me. It's time to do what you can to get power back for yourself. Let's get ready. Thanks for listening, folks. I want to invite anyone who's interested to come join us on Sunday, December 17th. We've got the community chat coming up at 2 p.m. Central. I want to hear what's going on the ground with you. And I want to thank everyone who gives. I put out the Giving Tuesday video mostly so that Gail wouldn't yell at me. Thanks, Gail. Thanks for not yelling at me. A lot of folks who have previously donated reached out and gave related to that. And I thank you for answering the call. Everyone who's contributing financially, all of the volunteers, we have a number of cool new volunteer projects going on with draft reading and with videography to try and recut some of the material into shorter formats and make it more shareable. I'm really excited about what's going on, and I'm so glad and so grateful to all of you who are here with me as we try to move forward into a good future. Let's get ready together. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.